Admiral Elena Torres stood at the viewport of the UES Subtle Knife, watching Earth's defense fleet take position. Most civilian observers would have called it small, barely 30 ships, none larger than a modern cruise ship. But size had never been humanity's strong suit, nor their measure of effectiveness. The massive vessels of the Vanguard Empire had appeared 3 days ago, their kilometer-long ships casting shadows across major cities as they positioned themselves in low orbit. Their declaration had been predictably pompous: submit to the glory of the Vanguard or face annihilation. They're powering up their main weapons, Admiral, Lieutenant James Kovic reported from his tactical station. Energy readings are, well, they're off the charts. Elena allowed herself a small smile. And our stealth systems? They haven't detected us. Their sensors are still focused on the decoy fleet. The Vanguard's first shot was spectacular, a beam of energy that lit up the sky like a second sun, aimed directly at what they thought was Earth's primary defense force. The holographic fleet, projected by satellites that had been dismissed as weather monitoring equipment, flickered satisfyingly as the beam passed through it. Now, Elena ordered, her voice calm despite the gravity of the moment. Execute Operation Whisper. Across Earth's orbit, 29 ships that had been hidden in plain sight dropped their stealth fields for just long enough to launch their payloads. The weapons were tiny by galactic standards, each no larger than a small car. The Vanguard sensors, calibrated to detect planet-killing weapons, barely registered them. Impact in 3, 2, 1. The massive Vanguard vessels didn't explode. They didn't break apart or burst into flames. Instead, they simply stopped. Their lights flickered and died. Their massive engines sputtered and went dark. Their supposedly impenetrable shields vanished as their power cores initiated emergency shutdowns. Direct hits on all targeted systems, Kovic reported, unable to keep the pride from his voice. Their power distribution networks are completely severed. Shield generators are offline. Weapons systems are dead. Elena watched as the mighty warships of the Vanguard began to drift, their crews suddenly discovering that backup systems they had never bothered to properly shield or maintain were completely useless. Open a channel to their flagship, she ordered. Wide broadcast, all frequencies. The communications officer nodded, and Elena cleared her throat. Vanguard Command Vessel, this is Admiral Elena Torres of the United Earth Space Force. Your ships are currently disabled and drifting. We have crews standing by to assist with emergency life support if needed, but any attempt to restore weapons or shields will result in immediate neutralization. The response, when it came, was a mixture of rage and disbelief. Impossible. Our ships are the mightiest in the galaxy. You cannot have defeated us with toys. Size isn't everything, Elena replied, allowing herself another small smile. Your ships are impressive, but you relied too heavily on raw power. You never considered that someone might target the small things, power relays, control systems, the humble components that keep your mighty vessels running. She paused, letting that sink in. We'll begin rescue operations shortly. In the meantime, I suggest you consider a revision to your standard first contact protocols. Attempting to intimidate new species isn't just rude, as you've discovered, it can be rather embarrassing. As her crew began coordinating the rescue of the stranded Vanguard ships, Elena reflected on humanity's first official contact with galactic civilization. It hadn't gone quite the way the Vanguard had planned, but perhaps that was for the best. The galaxy would soon learn that humanity's strength had never been in the size of their weapons or the scale of their ships. Their true power lay in understanding that every mighty fortress, every impenetrable defense, every overwhelming show of force had small, crucial points that held everything together. And humanity had perfected the art of finding those points. The Vanguard Empire had arrived expecting to add another primitive species to their collection. Instead, they had inadvertently announced humanity's arrival on the galactic stage. And while their massive ships drifted powerless in orbit, they were learning a lesson that the rest of the galaxy would soon come to understand: never mistake efficiency for weakness, and never, ever underestimate the species that had perfected the art of doing more with less. Captain Marcus Rivera walked through the bustling corridors of Ganymede Station, his footsteps silent in the artificial gravity. Around him, officers and analysts hurried past, their conversations hushed but intense. The Vanguard's humiliation at Earth had sparked exactly the response intelligence had predicted. Rather than learning from their defeat, they were preparing for war. He entered the Strategic Operations Center, where holographic displays showed the movements of Vanguard fleets across dozens of star systems. Their ships were even bigger now. Apparently, they believed the solution to their failure was to build larger weapons and stronger shields. "They're gathering quite the armada," commented Intelligence Director Maya Patel, not looking up from her data terminal. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she'd been analyzing patterns for days. "According to our deep cover operatives, they're calling it the Fleet of Absolute Dominion." Marcus couldn't help but smile. Subtle as always. "What's their actual strength?" 500 capital ships, each one larger than their first contact fleet. Energy weapons capable of cracking small moons. Shields they're claiming are impenetrable. She finally looked up, her expression wry. "They've also added 16 layers of redundancy to their power systems. But not to their supply lines? Not even one. They're so focused on making their ships bigger and their weapons stronger, they haven't even considered that might not be where they failed." Maya pulled up a new set of projections. "They've been dismissing our scout ships as civilian traffic. Haven't even bothered to challenge them. This was the art of being underestimated, a strategy humanity had perfected over the past 6 months. While the Vanguard built bigger ships and boasted about their upcoming revenge, human vessels had been quietly mapping their territory, probing their defenses, and most importantly, understanding their logistics. "Show me their supply network," Marcus ordered. The holographic display shifted, revealing a complex web of supply lines, ammunition depots, and fuel storage facilities. Tiny human ships, tagged with innocuous civilian transponder codes, could be seen moving through the network, each one gathering crucial data. "They're clustering their ammunition storage," Maya noted, highlighting several key points. Apparently, their logistics officers complained about the inefficiency of scattered depots. The military command overruled all safety concerns. They wanted to demonstrate their absolute confidence in their defenses. Marcus studied the pattern, noting how the Vanguard's arrogance had led them to ignore basic strategic principles. "They really believe we can't touch them. Have they even studied the reports from their first defeat?" "Oh, they studied them," Maya replied with a hint of amusement. "They just came to some interesting conclusions. Their analysis suggests we must have had some sort of super weapon that we've since exhausted. They're convinced our victory was a one-time trick that can't be repeated. And our actual capabilities?" Maya's fingers danced across her console, bringing up detailed scans of Vanguard ships. "Their new shields have a coverage gap near their power distribution nodes. They added so many layers of protection they didn't notice the interference pattern. Their ammunition feeds still run through unarmored sectors because they consider them too small to be targeted. And their command and control systems." She trailed off as a new alert flashed across her screen. "We just got confirmation. They're calling for their final fleet gathering. Every capital ship in their navy is being concentrated for what they're calling the decisive battle." Marcus watched as the massive fleet markers converged on a single point in space. The Vanguard were assembling the largest concentration of firepower the galaxy had ever seen. Their ships would blot out the stars, their weapons would be capable of reshaping solar systems, and their shields would indeed be the strongest ever created. And they still hadn't realized that none of that mattered. "Send word to Admiral Torres," he ordered. "Tell her Operation Needle Strike is ready to proceed. The Vanguard have given us exactly what we wanted, all their eggs in one very large, very vulnerable basket." As he turned to leave, Maya called after him. "They're broadcasting their battle plans on open frequencies. Their commander is promising to, and I quote, demonstrate the futility of human technological inadequacy." Marcus paused at the door. "You know, there's something almost admirable about their dedication to doing exactly what we hoped they would. Send me the full analysis. I want to make sure we don't waste this opportunity they're so generously providing." As he walked back through the station's corridors, Marcus reflected on the strange psychology that had led the Vanguard to this point. They were so convinced of their superiority, so certain that bigger meant better, that they couldn't even conceive of a different way of thinking. They saw humanity's smaller ships and precise weapons as signs of weakness rather than conscious choice. They interpreted our careful preparation as fear rather than strategy. And most importantly, they remained absolutely certain that their massive fleet, their planet-killing weapons, and their supposedly impregnable shields made them invincible. In 48 hours, humanity would demonstrate once again why that assumption was their greatest weakness. But for now, Marcus was content to let them believe in their invincibility. After all, there was no advantage quite like being underestimated by an overconfident enemy. Lieutenant Commander Aisha Rahman sat in the cockpit of her ship, the UES Precision, watching the clock tick down. Around her, 30 other stealth vessels waited in the artificial darkness of their sensor-dampening fields. To the massive Vanguard fleet less than a light minute away, they might as well have been invisible. "All ships, final systems check," she broadcast on the encrypted channel. Her crew responded with crisp efficiency, confirming that their specialized weapons were ready. These weren't the crude planet killers the Vanguard favored. Each projectile was a masterpiece of engineering, designed to target specific vulnerabilities with surgical precision. "Strike Team Actual, this is Control," Admiral Torres's voice came through clear and focused. "Operation Needle Strike is green. Execute on your mark." Aisha took a deep breath, reviewing the mission parameters one final time. The Vanguard had assembled their entire fleet, over 500 capital ships, arranged in a formation that they probably thought looked impressive. In reality, they'd just made targeting easier. "Strike teams, sync tactical computers and begin approach," she ordered. "Remember your training. No heroics, no deviations. We hit our assigned targets and withdraw immediately." The human fleet moved like shadows through space, their drives running silent, their profiles barely registering even on their own sensors. Ahead, the Vanguard fleet blazed with energy, their massive ships generating enough power to be visible from neighboring systems. "First waypoint reached," her navigator reported. "We're within optimal range." Aisha nodded, watching as the tactical display updated with real-time target data. "All ships, begin targeting sequence. Remember, power distribution nodes first, then ammunition feeds. Time on target is everything." The Vanguard's new defense systems were impressive, layers upon layers of energy shields, point defense weapons that could track and destroy incoming missiles, and armor thick enough to withstand direct hits from conventional weapons. But they still hadn't learned the fundamental lesson: bigger wasn't always better. "Target solutions locked," her weapons officer reported. "All ships report ready. Strike teams, execute." 30 ships fired simultaneously, each launching a spread of specially designed projectiles. They were tiny by military standards, barely larger than satellites, but they carried enough processing power to actively adjust their trajectories and avoid defensive fire. The Vanguard fleet's automatic defenses didn't even register the attack. Their sensors, calibrated to detect proper military weapons, dismissed the incoming projectiles as background radiation. By the time their crews realized something was wrong, it was too late. The first wave struck with perfect synchronization, each projectile finding its way through the microscopic gaps in the Vanguard's overlapping shields. They didn't explode or cause massive damage. Instead, they delivered precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulses directly to critical power nodes. First wave impact confirmed, Aisha announced, watching as status indicators began changing across the enemy fleet. Beginning second phase. The Vanguard ships, their crews still trying to understand why sections of their vessels were losing power, didn't notice the second wave until it was already through their weakened defenses. These projectiles targeted ammunition feeds, using minimal charges to trigger the safety protocols in the Vanguard's own weapons. "Ma'am, they're responding," her tactical officer reported. "Their fleet is breaking formation." Aisha watched as the mighty Vanguard armada began to scatter, their coordinated formation dissolving into chaos. Some ships were completely dark, their massive power plants shut down by their own safety systems. Others were trying to bring weapons online, only to find that their ammunition feeds had been locked down by their own protocols. "Control, this is Strike Team Actual," she reported. "Phase 2 complete. Enemy fleet is neutralized." She paused, allowing herself a small smile. "No casualties on either side." "Confirmed, Strike Team Actual," Admiral Torres replied. "Well done. Maintain position but do not engage further. Let's see how they respond to this lesson." The next few hours were almost anticlimactic. The Vanguard fleet, their mighty weapons silenced and their impenetrable shields failing, could only watch as their carefully planned revenge turned into another humiliation. Their commanders, who had been preparing victory speeches, now had to explain how they had lost without their enemies firing a single destructive shot. As Aisha observed the disabled fleet, she thought about the fundamental difference in philosophy that had led to this moment. The Vanguard had built their strategy around overwhelming force, bigger ships, stronger shields, more powerful weapons. They saw war as a contest of raw power. Humanity, tempered by millennia of conflict on Earth, had learned a different lesson. Victory didn't always go to the biggest or strongest. Sometimes, it went to those who understood that every system, no matter how powerful, had small, crucial weaknesses. And if you were precise enough, patient enough, and willing to think differently, those weaknesses were all you needed. "Strike teams, begin withdrawal," she ordered. "Let's leave them to think about what just happened." As her fleet disappeared back into the darkness of space, Aisha knew that this defeat would hit the Vanguard harder than the first. They had brought everything they had, unleashed their full might, and been defeated by an enemy they could barely detect. Perhaps now they would finally understand that size wasn't everything, but somehow, she doubted it. Commander David Chen stood in the Tactical Operations Center of Luna Base, watching as the holographic display updated in real time. Red markers representing Vanguard military installations were turning gray one by one, each transition representing another facility rendered inoperable by precisely targeted strikes. "Status report from Strike Team Delta," his communications officer announced. "Fuel processing center in the Arcturus sector has been neutralized. No casualties, but they won't be refining antimatter fuel for at least 6 months." David nodded, marking the target off his list. After the humiliation of their fleet's defeat, the Vanguard had fallen back on their remaining infrastructure, believing their vast network of supply bases and production facilities would allow them to rebuild. They hadn't realized that humanity had already mapped every critical node in their logistics network. "What's the status of Operation Domino?" he asked, turning to senior analyst Zara Patel, who was coordinating the strategic analysis of their campaign. "Proceeding exactly as modeled," she replied, pulling up a complex flowchart. "The Vanguard's military-industrial complex is collapsing sector by sector. They built everything on the assumption that bigger meant more secure. They never considered that centralizing their facilities would make them more vulnerable, not less." The display shifted to show a time-lapse of the past week. Human strike teams, using ships that the Vanguard sensors still dismissed as too small to be threats, had been systematically targeting key facilities across Vanguard space. They weren't destroying them, just precisely disabling critical components that would take months or years to replace. "New intelligence from the Vanguard capital," another analyst called out. Their war council is in complete disarray. 3 factions have emerged, one calling for immediate surrender, one demanding they build even bigger weapons, and one insisting this is all somehow part of their plan for ultimate victory. David couldn't help but shake his head. They still don't understand what's happening, do they? Show me the ammunition supply status. The hologram shifted again, displaying the Vanguard's ammunition production and distribution network. Or what was left of it. Their centralized ammunition factories, which they had proudly claimed could produce enough munitions to destroy a galaxy, were operating at less than 10% capacity. The sophisticated distribution systems they had built to feed their massive weapons were stuttering to a halt. "Sir," Zara called out, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "We're detecting increased activity at their remaining shipyards. They appear to be..." She paused, double-checking her data. "They're trying to build even larger ships. They think the solution is to make their weapons even bigger." "Of course they are," David sighed. "Because why learn from your mistakes when you can just double down on them?" "What's the status of their resource supply lines?" "Already compromised," another analyst reported. "Remember those insignificant, automated mining drones we've been ignoring for the past month? Turns out they were recalibrating the refineries. The Vanguard's shipyards are receiving raw materials that are microscopically different from their specifications. Any ships they build with them will have structural flaws before they leave the dock." David watched as more indicators turned gray across the display. The Vanguard's mighty industrial machine, built on the philosophy of bigger is better, was grinding to a halt. Not through massive battles or overwhelming force, but through precisely targeted strikes at critical weaknesses. Message from Admiral Torres, his communications officer announced. The Vanguard's home fleet just tried to sortie from their main base. Their ammunition feeds jammed as soon as they tried to power up their weapons. Apparently, the last batch of munitions they received had casings that were 1/10 of a millimeter too wide. 1/10 of a millimeter, David repeated, smiling slightly. Amazing how something so small can have such a large effect, isn't it? The Vanguard had built their empire on the principle of overwhelming force. Their ships were cities in space, their weapons could shatter planets, and their industrial base could supply armies that could darken the stars. But they had never understood that bigger systems meant more points of failure, more critical components that had to work perfectly, more things that could go wrong. "Sir," Zara called out again. "We're detecting a massive power surge from the Vanguard capital. There." She paused, checking her readings. "They're trying to bring their planetary defense system online. The one they said could destroy an entire invasion fleet." David watched as the massive weapon system, pride of the Vanguard's defensive capabilities, attempted to power up. For a moment, energy readings spiked off the charts. Then, with almost anticlimactic simplicity, everything went dark. "What happened?" he asked, although he already suspected the answer. "Remember those civilian contractors we let them hire to maintain their power grid?" Zara replied, unable to keep a note of satisfaction from her voice. "Turns out they've been installing control chips that were slightly miscalibrated. As soon as they tried to draw that much power, their entire grid crashed. It'll take them months to find all the compromised components." David looked at the holographic display, now showing more gray markers than red. The mighty Vanguard Empire, which had prided itself on building the biggest and most powerful everything, was being defeated not by a superior force, but by attention to detail. "Send word to all strike teams," he ordered. "Continue with the operation. Let's see how long it takes them to realize that sometimes, the smallest things make the biggest difference." Grand Admiral Elena Torres stood on the bridge of the UES Subtle Knife, watching as the last desperate gambit of the Vanguard Empire unfolded before her. They had gathered everything they had left, every ship that could still move, every weapon that could still fire, every scrap of power they could generate, into one final, massive display of force. "They're broadcasting on all frequencies," Lieutenant Kovac reported, his voice tinged with disbelief. They're challenging us to face them with honor, in open combat." Elena allowed herself a small smile. Even now, after everything that had happened, they still didn't understand. "How many ships do they have left?" 120 capital ships, Admiral. All of them showing signs of rushed repairs and jury-rigged systems. They've stripped their entire empire bare to make this fleet operational. Maya Patel's voice came through on the command channel. "Admiral, our analysis confirms they've completely abandoned their remaining supply lines to gather this force. They've left their infrastructure virtually undefended." "Because they think this is what matters," Elena replied, studying the massive fleet arrayed before them. "They still believe that victory goes to whoever has the biggest guns and the strongest shields." She paused, considering the situation. "What's the status of Operation House of Cards?" "All teams report ready," Marcus Rivera responded from his position coordinating the strike forces. "We can execute on your command." Elena nodded, watching as the vanguard fleet arranged itself in what they probably thought was an intimidating formation. Their ships, despite their rushed repairs and compromised components, were still impressive to look at. Each one was a monument to the philosophy that bigger was always better. "Send them our response," she ordered. The message was simple, transmitted on the same frequencies the Vanguard had used for their challenge: "Look behind you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, across Vanguard space, carefully planted devices activated. Power grids crashed. Automated systems initiated emergency shutdowns. Safety protocols, subtly modified over months of infiltration, engaged without warning. "Status report," Elena commanded, watching as the indicators began changing across their tactical display. "Their shipyards are going dark," Marcus reported. "Ammunition factories are shutting down. Fuel processing centers are initiating emergency containment procedures. Their entire industrial base is just stopping." On the main display, the Vanguard fleet remained in position, their commanders probably still trying to understand what was happening. Their mighty ships, gathered for one final battle, were about to learn a harsh lesson about the importance of supply lines. "Their weapons are drawing power," Kovac announced. "They're preparing to fire." Elena watched calmly as the massive weapons powered up. "Time until their ammunition reserves run out?" "At their current rate of fire, 3 minutes. They stripped everything for this attack. They have no reserves, no resupply capability, and now, no industrial base to manufacture more." The Vanguard fleet opened fire, their massive weapons lighting up space with enough energy to shatter planets. It was spectacular, impressive, and ultimately futile. Their targets, carefully projected holograms, flickered and vanished, revealing empty space where they had expected to find human ships. "Their ammunition stores are depleting," Kovac reported. "Power fluctuations detected across their fleet. The compromised components are starting to fail under combat stress." Elena nodded. "Send the final message." Across every command channel, every communication frequency, every display screen in the Vanguard fleet, the same message appeared: "The size of your weapons never mattered. What mattered was everything you ignored while building them." One by one, the mighty ships of the Vanguard began to go dark. Their rushed repairs failed. Their jury-rigged systems crashed. Their weapons, drained of ammunition with no hope of resupply, fell silent. The greatest fleet ever assembled was reduced to drifting hulks, not by overwhelming force, but by careful preparation and attention to detail. "They're surrendering," Kovac announced, almost unnecessarily. "Their command ship is broadcasting a general surrender across all frequencies." Elena looked at the disabled fleet, remembering how this had all started, with the Vanguard's attempt to intimidate Earth with their massive ships and powerful weapons. They had never understood that humanity's smaller ships and precise weapons weren't signs of weakness, but choices born from hard-learned lessons about the true nature of strategy. "Begin rescue operations," she ordered. "And make sure our terms of surrender include a comprehensive review of their military doctrine. I think it's time they learned that there's more to warfare than just building bigger guns." As her fleet moved to assist the stranded Vanguard ships, Elena reflected on the lessons of the war. The Vanguard had built their empire on the assumption that victory went to the largest weapons, the biggest ships, the strongest shields. They had never understood that sometimes, the smallest actions, precisely targeted, could bring down the mightiest empires. It was a lesson humanity had learned long ago, through countless conflicts on Earth. Size and power weren't everything. Sometimes, victory went to those who understood that every system, no matter how mighty, was only as strong as its smallest, most overlooked components. The galaxy would never be the same after this. The myth of overwhelming force had been shattered, replaced by a new understanding of strategy and precision. And humanity, the species that had perfected the art of doing more with less, was ready to help guide the galaxy toward this new understanding, one small step at a time.